It's the spring of 1692 in the month of May. 5 months since January, when 2 little girls in the house of Minister Samuel Parris began to complain of strange afflictions and torments caused by unseen hands. 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse is sitting in prison. She's been there since March, 2 months after the first accusations, and now 3 months that she's been in prison. She's been accused of witchcraft. Although she's been a full member of the church and a woman of outstanding reputation, she's been publicly humiliated by a hearing in a public meeting house where charges of witchcraft were leveled at her in public, and a host of accusers, young girls mostly between the ages of 12 and 17, made very theatrical performances describing how her spirit or her specter was in that moment afflicting them before the magistrates and the attending audience of townspeople. She was likely kept in chains in prison because it wasn't enough to accuse individuals of witchcraft. These girls would also complain that they continued to be afflicted by the spirits of these accused witches even though they remained in jail. And this required the accused to be kept in chains because presumably this somehow made their spirits less able to go out into the world and afflict other people. Rebecca Nurse and 37 other people are sitting in jail waiting for the newly appointed courts of Oyer and Terminer that have been put together by the new governor of the colony, William Phipps, to open in June. When they do, there's now going to be a formal court trial for all these people who've been accused of witchcraft. Many people imagine that the witch trials in Salem involved things like dunking of witches and burning at the stake. The dunking of a witch was supposedly a test used to see if a person was guilty or innocent of the charge of witchcraft. What would typically happen would be that the accused witch was tied up, hand and foot, and then there were ropes attached to their body, which were held by people on the shore, and the witch was normally dunked into the deep part of a river and completely submerged. Now, if a witch sunk to the bottom and wasn't visible above the water, then that proved that she was innocent. If, however, she seemed to float at all, then that was evidence that she was a witch, and she was going to be tried and punished as one. So it was really a no-win proposition, actually. And while things like dunking of witches were done in Europe during the witch craze, which we covered in a previous episode, these sorts of methods were not employed in New England during the Salem witch craze, nor was anybody burned at the stake. However, there were a great many very disturbing practices that were used to identify who was a witch and who was not, and there were a large number of people who were executed by hanging on the charges of witchcraft. Since January, the accusations in Salem Village have been multiplying like mushrooms. By the time that Governor Phipps returns and realizes that he has to set up a court, there are 38 accused witches sitting in jail awaiting trial. Now, up to this point, there have been these public hearings where local magistrates are questioning people who've been accused of witchcraft, and they're highly theatrical performances. The magistrates assume automatically the guilt of the person who's in front of them. And so typically the accused would have to stand in the meeting house, and the accusers, mostly a body of young girls, would stand there, and the accusations that these girls had been tormented by spectral or spirit visitations sent by the accused witch would then be made. But the girls would perform this in very colorful ways. So, for example, if an accused witch would reach a hand up and make some gesture, you would see a bunch of the accusing girls immediately mime the same gesture as though their bodily movements were somehow tied or controlled by the witch's body. If a witch looked an accused witch looked at the accusing girls, they would fall into fits, they would fall upon the floor, they would shriek, they would moan, and often become quite incoherent. And then the magistrate, in front of a very large audience of townspeople, would say to the accused, "Why do you torment these children in this way?" And of course the accused witch would say something like, "Well, I'm not doing anything." And then the magistrate would say, "Well, how do you explain this evidence of these people suffering in front of you? How can you explain the fact that your very glance causes them to fall into these terrible torments?" A question to which there is really no sensible answer. So there was no proof, there was no response that an accused witch could offer that would be sufficient to clear her, or in some cases, his name. The accusing girls in Salem Village were now complaining of seeing specters when they were at home, at night, at various times in the day, and these specters were spirit visitations that often resembled people who were about to be accused of witchcraft. But these specters became increasingly helpful as the months went on in identifying themselves and identifying other people who were also witches. And so you have 12, 14, 16, and 17-year-old girls explaining to the village how this particular woman had her spirit had visited them, had tormented them, and had helpfully described many other people who were also in league with the devil that she knew. More salaciously, the girls' testimonies began to include bits of gossip that had been circulating in these communities for years. So in several cases, the girls would begin to see spirits not just of the accused witches, but of dead people, former members of the community, sometimes children, sometimes deceased wives, who purportedly appeared in their burial shrouds and told these girls, "So-and-so, my husband, is a witch and he murdered me," or "So-and-so caused my death." And so in many cases, these charges or these suspicious deaths had been gossiped about for years, but now they became embedded in these charges, which actually made the penalties much stiffer. Because under English law, if a person was accused of practicing witchcraft, what they would call maleficum, or malevolent sort of magic, it might be, to cause someone's livestock to fall ill, or to cause someone to have a stomach ache, or some other ill health. That was one thing. And the penalty for that, previously, could be a year in jail, or possibly being put in the stocks, where a person was immobilized in a wooden structure and for several hours or sometimes days, and community members would throw rotten produce and excrement and other things at them as a sort of public humiliation ritual. But that was kind of minor bad practice. It was sort of small-scale magic, and so there was a precedent in older English law for that. But if you had someone who was not only as a witch tormenting people physically, but had also committed murder, and the ghosts of those people that they had murdered were coming forth from the dead to accuse them, now you had a more serious compounding of the charges, and the penalty for that would be correspondingly more severe. The magistrates who had been hearing these sort of informal witchcraft accusations before the formal courts opened in June had been busy from February onwards in Salem Village. And as they were holding these very public and very theatrical interrogations of the accused, there were a number of things that they were looking for as evidence that the accused was guilty. One of the most notorious was a thing called the touch test. In the touch test, for example, an accusing girl in the meeting house would see the accused witch look at her and fall into a fit. Then the magistrate would command the accused witch to go and touch the accusing girl who was in a fit. At the touch of this accused witch, the girl would suddenly become still, and her suffering would appear to cease. Then the accused witch would go back to wherever she was supposed to be standing, and the accusing girl would be instructed by the magistrate to attempt to approach the witch and touch her. And of course, the girl would invariably be unable to do this. She would appear to be held back by invisible forces. She would attempt to walk in the direction of that accused witch and then fall to the floor. And this was taken to be evidence that the accused was in fact causing torment to the girl, which is why the touch of that witch would cause the torment to cease. And the witch's power would prevent the accusing girl from approaching to touch her. So the touch test was used again and again by magistrates in these informal hearings, as well as in the formal legal proceedings of the courts, which are going to be commencing at the beginning of June. But there were a number of other things that the magistrates and then the judges in the official courts began to look for. And these things were based on writing about witchcraft that had been circulating in previous decades. There were a number of books that had been written by ministers in New England about the supernatural and about how to identify witches and how to go about investigating these charges. And the magistrates and later judges in Salem Village heavily drew on this literature in order to inform their proceedings. So, among the things that were taken to be evidence or proof of witchcraft were accusations of spectral torment, which is what the girls in Salem Village began with, being named by another accused witch. So if a woman had her name dropped by somebody else who'd been accused of witchcraft, and that person said, this woman is also a witch, then that was taken to be evidence that you likely were a witch. If you were accused of witchcraft, you could be asked to recite the Lord's Prayer at any point during your interrogation. And if you were unable to do this, you forgot a couple of words, you messed up the order, you missed a line, that was very strong evidence that you were working with the devil. Now, that may seem like an easy test to pass, especially for people who were very religious and attending church regularly in Puritan New England. But you have to understand the extreme degree of emotional distress and the hounding and the catcalling and the accusation and the humiliation, the extraordinary level of pressure that would be placed on this person who was essentially being pilloried in these interrogations. They were being watched by others, girls were performing, magistrates or judges were hurling accusations at you, and then in the middle of this someone would say, all right, now recite the Lord's Prayer. The level of disturbance and emotional distress that an individual would be experiencing in these circumstances would easily cause a slight error in rehearsing something like this from memory, but that could be a fatal error. One of the most disgusting things that was part of the witch trials in Salem, as well as in Europe, was the belief that a witch who was working with the devil would have some sort of witch mark on his or her body. So this was related to the belief that a witch had a familiar spirit. And we still have this idea in terms of Halloween witches and black cats. That's descended from this idea that a real witch who's working with the devil kind of has an evil demon of some kind that hangs out with her, usually in the form of an animal, and that this animal is supposed to nurse from the witch's body. It doesn't mean that the witch is necessarily lactating, but there's some sort of nourishment that's being sucked from the witch's body by this spirit. And so the search for the witch mark was the search for some place that could be where this familiar spirit would be suckling, or some other mark that might be obtained because the witch had signed a pact with the devil. So they would be looking for anything that looked a little bit unusual, or any mole or mark that seemed less sensitive to, for example, being stabbed with a pin than other parts of the body. And investigators in Salem were relentless in their search for this witch mark. So many of the women who were in jail at the time in Salem, and the men too, were stripped, spread-eagled, and examined by a committee of women in the case of female accused, or a committee of men in the case of men who'd been accused. And they would examine the body in intimate detail. We're talking about a close-up look at the genitalia between vagina and anus. And we know this because it's detailed in primary sources. And I'm going to read you an example of what they found. I'm going to take this quote from the excellent book In the Devil's Snare, The Salem Witchcraft Crisis, to which I'm greatly indebted in my preparation of the material for this episode, and indeed for all of the material regarding Salem. The women's jury, led by a Salem town chirurgeon and apothecary, Dr. John Barton, issued 2 reports on June the 2nd. After inspecting the bodies of Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, and Elizabeth Proctor by diligent search, the jurors initially explained that they found a preternatural excrescence of flesh between the pudendum and anus, much like to teats and not usual in women, and that they were, in all the 3 women, near the same place. By contrast, they saw nothing unusual on the bodies of Alice Parker, Susanna Martin, or Sarah Good, whom they also searched. Several hours later, a re-examination revealed that the strange teat-like pieces of flesh on the first 3 women had disappeared, being replaced by dry skin, and also that Susanna Martin's breast, which in the morning, quote, appeared to us very full, unquote, was now, quote, all lank and pendant, unquote. The jurors' findings implied that in the interim, the 4 women had all been sucked by their animal familiars. So imagine for a moment this new level of humiliation, after being kept in jail for months, now to be intimately examined, sometimes multiple times in a day, and the details of one's most private parts written about and presented to the court in public as evidence, perhaps, of one's practice of witchcraft. Another thing that was taken to be evidence of someone's practice of witchcraft was the presence of what were called poppets, which were basically doll-like figures stuck with pins. So in the cases of some women accused of witchcraft in Salem, men would come forward and say, oh yes, several years ago I visited this woman's farm and we were cleaning out the barn and we saw some strange-looking dolls with things stuck in them that she couldn't explain. Clearly she's a witch. So this sort of thing would be offered as evidence of guilt. And finally, wounds that were given to spectral apparitions of a witch, if they were then found on the physical body of the actual person accused of witchcraft, or any trace that could be connected, were taken to be very clear evidence that this person had been wandering around as a spirit, and if a girl tried to stab that spiritual form with a knife, for example, and there was some sort of a scratch or a bruise on the body of the accused witch in something like the same region, or any region at all really, that could be evidence that she was a witch. So these very dubious forms of evidence were employed by both the magistrates in the informal hearings prior to June, and then they were taken as legal evidence by the actual judge and jury of the courts, the Oyer and Terminer courts that were set up and began their first hearing on June the 2nd. The name of these courts, Oyer and Terminer, may sound odd to us, but it literally means to hear, Oyer, and to decide. So these 2 courts were used for the trial and then the sentencing of accused witches. So when these courts began to hear these cases in front of judges and in front of a jury, there was a procedure that they used, which is sometimes difficult to reconstruct, but the evidence we have suggests it went something like this. The accused person would be standing in the courtroom, and the accusing girls would first level their accusations in public again. So they would say, this person visited me last Tuesday night and threatened that if I did not sign the devil's book, she would tear me into pieces. And then she choked me, her specter or her spirit choked me most terribly, and I suffered for hours. And so these sorts of accusations would be made and repeated. And usually the accusers would then demonstrate how much they were suffering by going into fits right there as the accused looked in their direction. Then other confessors came in. So confessors were other people who had been accused of witchcraft, who had confessed that they were guilty and then had helpfully named names of other people they consorted with in serving the devil. So these people, and there were quite a number of them, would then be used as evidence of this new accused person's guilt. So the confessors would come forward and say things like, yes, this person joined with us last month when we drank red blood and ate red bread and praised the devil and decided that we were going to tear down the kingdom of God in Salem and build up the kingdom of the devil. She was there and she also participated in all of these sorts of things. So you would hear this sort of thing. The third thing that would happen would be members of the community who identified themselves as witnesses of past acts of evil or maleficum that were committed by the accuser would come forward and make their charges. So here you would have neighbors saying things like, oh yes, on such and such a day 2 years ago, I quarreled with this woman and then my child got sick. Clearly she's a witch. She cursed us and my child got sick. Or I had a disagreement with this woman and then she muttered under her breath and the next week my cows died. So these sorts of things would be presented by other members of the community as additional evidence of that person's guilt. One example of evidence that a community witness brought of past practices that would make somebody a witch was leveled at a woman named Mary Bradbury, who was accused of witchcraft. One witness declared that he thought Mistress Bradbury had bewitched a ship on which he sailed to the West Indies about 11 years earlier. And Richard Carr swore that he, his father, and another observer believed that years earlier they had seen Bradbury turn herself into a spectral blue boar that then attacked their horses. Richard's brother James attested that in the early 1670s, so 20 years ago, he had become strangely ill for 9 months after a courtship visit to a young widow named Rebecca. Rebecca had most courteously invited him to come oftener to her house, James recalled, suggesting that he was a preferred suitor. But the next time he visited her, James told the jury, Mary Bradbury's son William was also there, but the young widow did so coarsely treat William Bradbury that he went away seeming to be angry. James then became sick. And as everyone in the courtroom knew, during his extended illness, Rebecca married William Bradbury. So the point of this confession is to say that Mary Bradbury, who's just been accused of witchcraft, made this James guy sick so that her son William can marry the pretty young widow and James is going to be out of luck. So this has happened 20 years ago. But this guy, James, is now coming to the court and saying, this woman's clearly a witch. She's the reason why I didn't get to marry that pretty woman that I wanted to marry 20 years ago, and her son got to marry that woman. It must be because she's a witch. That's the kind of pettiness, that's the kind of grudges that are now being aired in court and taken as evidence that can be enough to remove a person's life. Then the jury that had inspected the accused's body in the way that I have just described for evidence of the witch's mark would come forward and present whatever they had found before the judge in the courtroom. So they would say things like, oh yes, we examined her body and we found a strange thing underneath her vagina, which then seemed to disappear a few hours later, so that's evidence that she's a witch. After all this, the accused person then had an opportunity to verbally respond and attempt to defend themselves. They had no access to a lawyer because in English criminal law at this time, someone who was accused of capital crimes was not entitled to an attorney. So this person, alone up there by themselves, having been condemned by multiple people that they knew very well, neighbors, sometimes extended family members, and these girls would then have an opportunity to say whatever they might come up with in their defense. But it was inevitably futile. I've not, in my reading on this subject, come across any example of a person whose verbal response to this got them out of the charge or changed anyone's mind. It seems that the outcome of these trials was already determined, and it was simply a matter of formalizing a verdict. The first case that was heard by the courts in June was of an elderly woman named Bridget Bishop. And following the procedures I've just described, she was convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to hang, which she did at the end of that month. Following this grim sight, an execution of a woman well known to everyone in the community, which was witnessed by many people in person, the pace of accusations that these young girls were leveling seemed to die down for a few days. And perhaps the gravity of what had just been done began to sink in, because we do have evidence that some people in the community were becoming increasingly disturbed by what had just happened and by the entire panic that had continuously spiked with ever more colorful and more damning accusations since January. So one member of the community, a minister by the name of William Milbourne, actually drafted a petition that he wanted to send to Governor Phipps. Now, Governor Phipps was the ultimate authority in that colony. He represented the British Crown. He was the one who had the authority to set up these courts, and he also would have the authority to overrule them. So this minister drafted a petition protesting the fact that there were accusations growing against people of unspotted reputation, including a former minister to Salem Village itself by the name of George Burroughs, and another a military officer by the name of Captain John Alden. So this minister, William Milbourne, was saying, where does this stop? I mean, apparently anyone is vulnerable to these charges, including people who have inhabited positions of leadership and who have got a good reputation and a lot of responsibility. So what's going on here? He, in particular, wanted to cast doubt on the reliability of spectral evidence. And the spectral evidence was just these accounts that these young girls kept bringing forward of saying, last night I was visited by the apparition of this person and they tormented me, or this ghost told me that this person was a witch who had caused their death. So that was definitely the evidence that seemed to be used most frequently and relied upon most heavily. And Milbourne, in his petition, was beginning to question how reliable those accounts could be. So in particular, he would say things like, well, if these girls are really talking to witches who are servants of the devil, how can we rely on what these specters say to be truthful? I mean, isn't the devil the father of lies? Isn't his job to deceive us all? If these girls are conversing with dark forces, why should we believe that what they're supposedly told by these dark forces is in fact the truth? Furthermore, he and many other people began to wonder, just because you saw a spectral image of somebody, did it mean that that person was a witch? Could it not be that some other person was a witch who was going forward disguised as innocent members of the community to torment people and thus cast doubt on innocent people? So these were the sorts of questions that Milbourne raised, and many other people too, but they were doing so quietly because the official position that the judges seemed to have, which was reflected by the literature that they had been reading, was that if you doubted the presence of witches or the ability of Satan to do these sorts of things, then that was itself a sign that you might be more likely to be deceived and led astray by the dark side. It would endanger yourself to be speaking these things publicly or carelessly. And many people who did voice these kinds of doubts out loud found themselves next on the list of accused people. Now, in the case of William Milbourne's petition, he was planning to present it to Governor Phipps, but first he sort of quietly went around the community and tried to gather signatures on this so that there'd be a formal expression of the doubts that people were having. However, word of this petition reached the governor before Milbourne officially was going to present it, and he was sort of hauled up on the carpet. He was dragged in to see the governor and the council and basically told, what are you doing going around casting doubt on the reliability and the authority of these courts that I have set up? what you're doing is seditious, it's wrong, and basically you can either pay a fine and shut up, or you can go to jail. So that was the end of the Milbourne petition, and it was a strong sign of the social climate in which all this was going on. The judges and the governor had already invested some personal capital and credibility in being part of the process of trying these accused witches. And so to place doubt on the type of evidence being used or the procedures they were following would in fact impugn the reputations of the men who were now in charge of this process. So Reverend Milbourne wasn't the only person expressing doubts about this whole process. The family of Rebecca Nurse, the 71-year-old woman who got thrown into prison in March, she was going to be tried by these courts, and her family was busy going around collecting signatures of neighbors and people in the community attesting to her exemplary character. They gathered 39 signatures of people brave enough to speak up about her innocence and about the fact that they thought the charges against her were baseless. They presented this to the court, but she was formally charged and scheduled for a trial anyway. So the judges had no interest in this attestation of faith in her character. The family then turned to attacking the credibility of the accusing girls, which was a highly risky thing to do because other people who'd raised questions about them had found themselves in the position of being accused very quickly. But they made statements accusing some of the girls who were teenage maids of being consummate liars previously, so impugning their reputation for telling the truth and saying, well, if we've got evidence that these people were caught in lies many times before, why should they now be accepted as credible witnesses? They also pointed out inconsistencies in the girls' statements about their demonic visions and spectral visitations. And the family said, well, if these girls are so often conversing with the devil and witches, can they really be so innocent themselves? They say that they haven't signed the devil's book and they're not on the dark side, but they sure seem to talk to these people a lot. So how can we rely on them to be giving us the straight goods? And most damningly, the daughter of Rebecca Nurse, who was an adult, Rebecca herself was 71, so her daughter would have been middle-aged, was sitting in court watching the trial of her elderly mother, and she said that she noticed one of the teenage girls, who was an accuser, pull pins out of part of her clothing where she had concealed them, stab herself with them, and then claim right there in court that the specter of Rebecca Nurse had just now stabbed her with these pins. Which is a pretty horrifying thing if it's true, and it very likely was. There was another such incident that also happened during the court hearings. One of the girls who was leveling accusations at an accused witch pulled out a fragment of a knife from her pocket and said, "This knife was used to stab me by this witch." And a man in the audience said, wait a second. That broken bit of blade is my knife. I broke it yesterday and I threw it away. And at this point, instead of questioning the girl's credibility and throwing out the statement, the judge simply admonished the girl to stick to the facts, and she was allowed to carry on with other accusations. So there was clearly an investment on the part of the judges in accepting the girl's credibility. And this raises an interesting point, which is that this whole process, where these often underage girls, who otherwise would have had no status in the community, now being the focus point of accusations that are going to result in executions, it wasn't possible without the collusion of several adult male members of this community. In particular, Reverend Samuel Parris, in whose house, you may recall, this whole thing began, with the original 9-year-old and 11-year-old girls complaining of torment and making accusations of witchcraft. In many cases, we have records that the accusing girls would go into fits and they would be so hysterical with their torment that they couldn't actually speak very clearly in making their accusations against the person on the stand. And Minister Parris would helpfully come forward and say, well, I can remember what happened. I remember this girl said that, a month ago she was tormented by this woman and she suffered in these following ways, and so on. So the voices of these men, ministers like Samuel Parris, other ministers like Cotton Mather, speaking in favor of these proceedings were definitely very significant in supporting the credibility of what was going on. And without that credibility, it could not have continued to grow and reach the horrifying proportions that it did. This raises the question of why some of these men would be interested in supporting these claims and in forwarding this. And their motives would probably be individual, but it would seem that in some cases there were long-standing grudges that could now be paid back by supporting accusations against someone that particular man viewed as an enemy or someone who had done him wrong. Most horrifying was the execution of George Burroughs, who was one of the original 3 ministers that Salem Village had hired before they got Samuel Parris into the job. So George Burroughs was sort of a village pastor. He wasn't officially ordained, but he took on the job, which meant he would be allocated a certain amount of land. His job would be to preach in the church and to perform other functions of a minister, but he couldn't give communion and he couldn't preside over making someone a member of the church or not. So he served in this position for a few years. He eventually left it, and he ends up being one of the people accused of witchcraft. In his case, people in the community came forward and said things like, well, George Burroughs is a small man, but his strength is so large. He can lift things with one arm that most other men would have to use 2. He can pull a heavy molasses barrel up with 2 fingers and swing it around, and most of us have to work really hard to get it off the ground. So this must clearly be evidence that he's got demonic help. There had also been long-standing gossip about the deaths of 2 of George Burroughs' wives that had been circulating for years, along with accusations that he was cruel to them or beat them. And so other people in the community were related to these women, and these sorts of slanders or accusations or resentments against George Burroughs come out in the trial. But most damning of all is when George Burroughs is taken to be hung for being a convicted witch. He's facing the gallows. He makes a very moving speech. Apparently, he recites the Lord's Prayer flawlessly in front of everybody there. And people in the community are so moved by his words and by his attitude that there is suddenly fear that the crowd is actually going to prevent his execution. And at this point, Cotton Mather, another prominent minister in the area, from horseback, begins to yell at the crowd and say, don't be deceived by this man. The devil can masquerade as an angel of light. His fine words and his piety are no proof of his innocence. On with the execution. And so single-handedly, Cotton Mather uses his authority to condemn this man and to see him publicly hung. So there's definitely evidence that there are these sorts of roiling resentments and grudges and gossip that are heavily involved in the accusations and in who gets hung. The official trials begin in June, and by July there is evidence that judges in these courts are using torture to extract confessions from accused witches. So one accused witch will perhaps confess and name names of other people who are witches. Why would they name names? Because they were heavily pressured to do so by their interrogators. They were told that the only way to save their souls was to confess, that they must be witches, they know they are witches, it is clear that they are witches, and so there'd be this barrage of insistence from authoritative members of the community who were judges and ministers and men of authority to put pressure on the accused, most often women, to confess. And so you couldn't just confess your own evil deeds. As a token of your good faith and the sincerity of your confession, you had to name other people. And so Perhaps one accused witch confesses and names some other people. These ones are brought in and subjected to the same pressure, the same admonitions, threats, and so on, but perhaps they refuse to confess. So by July, there's evidence that some young people, particularly a pair of teenage boys who were the sons of a woman who'd been accused of witchcraft, they were then accused, not by their mother, but throughout the witch trials, if you were at all connected to someone who had been accused of witchcraft, you were very likely to be targeted next. So a spouse, a child, a maidservant, a brother or a sister, if you had a family member who was accused, you were likely next. So in the case of these teenage boys, their mother had been accused and they were dragged in and also accused of being witches, and they refused to confess. The evidence is that they were tied up in stress positions for many hours. What else was done to them has not been written down, but we know these boys wrote a letter begging to have their trial elsewhere and stating that they had been tortured to produce these confessions. And they weren't the only ones. So if threats and moral condemnation and the threat of eternal punishment didn't work, a little good old-fashioned torture might be just the thing to extract a confession that would verify the guilt of people already accused and supply fresh victims. Seeing how the trials were going, some people who had been in jail for several months and were richer members of the community had now had the opportunity to see a couple of people go before the courts in June and July. They saw the court proceedings I've already outlined, where guilt was pretty much predetermined, and realized what was coming for them if they would be standing in front of such a court, that there was no defense that was going to allow them to escape conviction. So some richer prisoners, with the help of their families, succeeded in bribing a jailer and escaping prison and fleeing from Salem, sometimes to New York or more distant cities where they would be out of the reach of this madness. In the case of the two boys who were tortured, whose written statements about this we have, they were the sons of Martha Carrier, and within a short amount of time, in August, their younger siblings, Sarah, who's 8 years old, and Thomas, who is 10 years old, are also dragged in and forced to confess to being witches. So a mother and 4 of her children, some of them as young as 8, are now in prison accused of witchcraft. The children were all forced to identify their mother, Martha Carrier, as having recruited them into being witches. So it wasn't just that they were terrified, it wasn't just that they were tortured, they were required to incriminate their own mother. By August, the accusations and the circle of people who were being accused and dragged into prison had spread outside of Salem Village into the neighboring town of Andover. And in this community, people who were accused mainly accused their relatives when they confessed. So we see these circles of people who are related to each other all winding up in jail on accusations of witchcraft in a wave of fear that seems increasingly bizarre. A woman named Elizabeth Johnson is accused in Andover, and they arrest her and immediately her 11-year-old daughter and 14-year-old son as well. So why are these people confessing? Well, here's a statement from a woman at the time explaining why she confessed to witchcraft even though she knew she was entirely innocent. And this again comes from In the Devil's Snare by Mary Beth Norton. And I quote, "One member of this group, Mary Tyler, later described to Minister Increase Mather the specific reasons for her confession. En route from Andover to Salem, after the touch test, she declared her brother-in-law, John Bridges, rode with her. And she says here, quote, all along the way, her brother-in-law kept telling her that she must needs be a witch, since the afflicted accused her, and at her touch were raised out of their fits, and urging her to confess herself a witch. On the road, she rejected his pleas, but when they had arrived in Salem town, she was taken to a room where John Bridges and the Reverend John Emerson combined to insist that she certainly was a witch, and that she saw the devil before her eyes at that time, meaning in that moment. And accordingly, the said Emerson would attempt with his hand to beat the devil away from her eyes. As a result, she recalled, she wished herself in any dungeon rather than be so treated. Her brother-in-law asserted that, quote, God would not suffer so many good men to be in such an error about it, and that she would be hanged if she did not confess. Finally, she became so terrified in her mind that she owned at length almost anything they propounded to her. So here you see a woman who's being pressured by a member of her family. She's being pressured by the minister. She's being told that so many good men recognize the truth of these charges. They can't be wrong. You must be a witch. And furthermore, if you don't confess, you're going to be hanged. So the combination of these things produced many confessions of people desperate to save their own lives, hoping that if they confessed, they might just be jailed for a while and ostracized as opposed to executed. The process of trial, conviction, and sentencing is ongoing from June through the summer and peaks in September. By the time September rolls around, there is an increasingly vocal sense of unrest and misgiving about what's been going on. About 200 people have been accused of witchcraft and jailed. By the time September rolls around, 19 people have been hung, and one, Giles Corey, whom we discussed in a previous episode, has been pressed to death. So 20 people have been executed. Why haven't there been more people executed? Because it's time-consuming to go through these trials and hearings and listen to the evidence and present all these witnesses and so on. The process is rolling on, but by the time there are 20 bodies of people that everyone knows that have been put into the ground in September, people are beginning to squawk. And even though there's a lot of pressure to be quiet, and even though it's risky to be openly critical, there are nonetheless a number of episodes that have shaken everyone's confidence. We have images of elderly women standing in front of the gallows and making their last statements to the judges and to the community, saying, I don't wish you to spare my life, but I wish that you would think about what you're doing because you don't want to be guilty of innocent deaths. And that's what's happening here. So you have people that aren't pleading in their own defense, but they're pleading on behalf of other people in their last moments. And images like this of upright, often elderly women, or of men who have been in positions of leadership and trust, facing death in these ways are beginning to cause people to be very deeply disturbed. So by the time September comes to an end, there are official misgivings that now Governor Phipps is considering, letters that have been written by other influential ministers in the community suggesting that perhaps the courts are going outside the realm of what could be excused, that they are accepting forms of evidence that are dubious, and that some of the people who are going to the gallows are perhaps not witches. By the time October rolls around, the court has paused. Governor Phipps is now considering these various pieces of protest or concern that have been put in front of him. And by the end of the month, he shuts down the two courts of Oyer and Terminer and has to consider what his next step is going to be. Because there are still well over 100 people, probably about 180 people, sitting in jail on accusations of witchcraft. So he's shutting down the court that was going to hear and sentence, but something still has to be done with all these people who are sitting in jail. In addition, in October, some of the people who had confessed to witchcraft and named other people begin to recant their confessions. Somewhat like the woman whose testimony I read you, they begin to say, look, I was under a lot of pressure. I was threatened with hanging. I said whatever they told me I needed to say, but it wasn't true. These sorts of things begin to happen increasingly, and so the authority of the court and the validity of the accusations begins to unravel. After Governor Phipps shuts down the courts at the end of October, he has some time to reconsider what to do now with the remaining large number of people who are accused. Some of them have escaped by bribing a jailer and running away, but there are still a lot of people in these jails. So he sets up a new court in late January, early February of 1693. So a year from the first accusations made by those two little girls in 1692 in January. A year later, he sets up a new court to deal with the remaining number of people who are still languishing in jail, many of them for almost a year, on these accusations. This court tries 52 of those people. It only convicts 3, but it doesn't execute anybody. Most people are acquitted. 9 of them are dismissed without any trial at all. And basically there's a processing of hearing or considering the cases against these people and just writing them off or pardoning them or saying that the charges were not valid in the first place. Or even if they were, we're not going to punish you, just get out of jail and go home. By April, in the final hearings, all of the people who had been left in jail have been acquitted. Rebecca Nurse, the 71-year-old woman with whom we began today's episode, didn't survive. She was hung, despite the best efforts of her family, despite a petition signed by many people in the community, as were many other upright people of good reputation as well. Some of them stayed in jail for months even after they'd been acquitted and the charges had been dropped because there was a bail that had to be paid to get the person out of jail. And so unless you could find someone in your family to do that for you, you might be sitting there for a while longer. But eventually, everyone was cleared from jail. For some people, it took a few more months. The last person to leave jail was Tituba, who you may recall was the very first person accused of witchcraft. We talked about her in an earlier episode. She was the slave of Reverend Samuel Parris, the one who was taking care of the 2 little girls, aged 9 and 11, who first began to suffer torments. And she was the slave who was beaten by Minister Samuel Parris until she confessed to being a witch and obligingly provided all the colorful details that he was hoping to hear, and which were used as the foundation for how many witches they needed to look for and the sort of bad magic that was afflicting Salem village. Reverend Parris refused to pay her bail to get her out of jail, and so she sat there for quite a while, until finally the money was raised by some unnamed person whom she was then sold to as a slave. What became of her husband and her child, who had remained in the house of Samuel Parris, we don't know. It seems unlikely that she was ever reunited with them. The records show that she left town in the company of her unnamed new master. In the wake of all this, there were some people who immediately presented themselves as apologists for the trial. And by apologist, I don't mean saying sorry, I mean justifying the entire thing. So Minister Cotton Mather, who from horseback had encouraged a crowd that had seemed reluctant to execute former Minister George Burroughs, he was busy writing a book immediately after the close of this trial, justifying everything that had happened. And basically saying that yes, witches were real, spectral evidence was real, the nature of the spiritual danger that was afflicting Salem village was very serious, and the judges were doing exactly what they should have been doing. So if there were any mistakes made, it was because of the devil, who is the father of lies and deceives people. So if there were mistakes made, it was the devil's fault. Nobody who was actually involved in accusing, sentencing, or hanging anybody needs to actually shoulder any responsibility for what happened. However, there were a great many people who didn't agree with Cotton Mather. When his book came out, he was the subject of a large amount of abuse, which he found very hard to understand and complained about to his father. He was quite learned, graduated from Harvard, was sort of upper-class New England, and couldn't understand the resentment that people felt at the book that he had written exonerating the Salem Witch Trials. The family of Rebecca Nurse, that 71-year-old grandmother who was hung, also didn't forget. And while they were willing to forgive one of the young girls whose confession had sent Rebecca Nurse to the gallows, they weren't as forgiving of Samuel Parris, their former minister. One of the young girls in 1706, so this would have been 15 or so years after the trials were finished, publicly came forward in Salem, in the church, and said that she deserved to be humiliated and to lie in the dust for the accusations that she had brought against Rebecca Nurse in particular, who was an innocent woman. So she very publicly recanted what she had done. And she said, I was a child, I was deceived by the devil, I didn't mean to hurt anybody, but what I did was really wrong and quite horrible. So the family of Rebecca Nurse was formally reconciled with this young woman who had now publicly recanted what had been done. However, they were instrumental in driving Samuel Parris out of Salem Village. So basically causing him to lose his job, lose his position, and he had to leave town because they and many other people obviously held him directly responsible for continuously upholding the credibility of the accusations, for pushing through the authority of the trials, and thereby creating an environment in which so many people, many of whom had been members of his congregation, could be executed. Now, we like to think of witches and witchcraft as being a figment from a far distant past. Some of us are going to laugh in our sleeves at the ideas of villagers in New England being terrified by invisible specters sailing around the village and tormenting people with invisible hands. But the truth is, the mechanisms that drove the Salem witch trial to its increasingly bloody conclusion are alive and well with us. They are like viruses in a herd that only require the right set of conditions for an outbreak. Now, there are a number of lessons that the Salem episode underlines for us and which remain incredibly relevant even today. The first few have to do with legal proceedings. First of all, the importance of presuming an accused person innocent. We saw again and again in Salem people being brought into a courtroom and the verdict had already been decided. It was merely a matter of very theatrical procedure to level in public the charges that were going to be pinned to this person who was doomed to be convicted. That's not a system that produces justice. It's just a system that produces convictions. And so these mechanisms that we've developed, like the presumption of innocence, take more time. They're more labor intensive. They require more work in a courtroom to examine and to organize a criminal defense. But they are the only thing that stand between us and farcical courts like the one that was in operation in Salem. The second principle that remains incredibly relevant to us today is the importance of outlawing torture. We saw the use of torture to elicit confessions in Salem, and it was very extensively used in Europe during the witch hunt there that led to the executions of tens of thousands of people. And the fact remains that under torture, a person is going to say whatever they think they have to say to make the pain stop. So an interrogator can custom design a set of confessions and walk the tortured victim through admitting to absolutely anything. And these confessions are then used to justify the charges or the beliefs that the interrogators already have about what's going on, and to then legitimize the collection of further victims, and so the cycle continues. So torture will produce confessions, but it won't produce the truth. There might be fragments of truth thrown in, but ultimately a person under those conditions will say absolutely anything. The third observation are the standards of what constitutes evidence. And Salem is a great example of what happens when you throw that out the window. And people are talking about visions, dreams, half-imagined, half-remembered ideas about wild pigs that might have been blue running through the forests. And these sorts of things are presented as evidence that a person is guilty. The credibility of a witness and the nature of what is accepted as evidence are absolutely essential to the fairness of a trial. Because unless those things are scrutinized, and unless judges are paying attention to how credible a witness is or what is allowed as evidence, you can convict anybody of anything. Now, these things are not just arcane observations about legal procedure. These are safeguards that we've developed because of examples like Salem, of what happens when we don't have these protections in place. But they remain very vulnerable, because when people are afraid, when people begin to panic at some external threat, they're anxious for a response. And in that anxiety, they want a swift, decisive, and rapid system of dealing with whatever they perceive to be putting them in danger. And that's the point at which they are ready to sweep away the normal procedures of trial and the presumption of innocence and evidence and all that, with absolutely terrifying results. And we've seen two very obvious examples of this in far more recent American history. The McCarthy period occurred right after World War II, when America was paranoid about the presence of potential communist sympathizers in their midst. It's the beginning of the Cold War. We've just finished World War II, and now people are worried about the communist threat, the external communist nations outside of America, but more concerned about people inside America who might be working for that external communist enemy. And because people are so afraid, they are willing to condemn and to accuse other Americans on the slightest shreds of hearsay. So a commission is set up, you have Senator McCarthy in charge, and he starts blacklisting people who are suspected of having communist sentiments. And getting yourself onto that blacklist meant losing your job, losing your reputation, being ostracized, and sometimes being jailed. And if you were so bold as to speak up in defense of one of these people, you yourself could be the next accused of being a communist sympathizer. So many of the same dynamics that drove the Salem crisis are evident in moments of history like that. And more recently, after the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon, there's again a widespread sense of fear and rage that pervades all of America. And what this leads to is a demand for swift and decisive action. In response, we see the creation of prisons like Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib, where suspected terrorists are rounded up and thrown into prison without trial. There's no investigation of guilt or innocence. There's no examination of evidence. There's no inspection of the credibility of witnesses. In fact, there are some people in countries where suspected terrorists were rounded up who heard that Americans were looking for terrorists and were offering a reward for names and decided to enrich themselves by providing some names. People end up in these prisons without the chance of a trial, with no ability to defend themselves or to hear the credibility of the charges against them. And many of them are subjected to torture, what was euphemistically termed enhanced interrogation techniques, which included waterboarding, which included being tied up in stress positions, which included being whipped and beaten, left in cold rooms, stripped naked, deprived of sleep, and so on and so forth. Under these conditions, people end up breaking down. And to cause the treatment to stop, they will become willing to say whatever an interrogator wants to hear. Again, this sort of treatment happens when people are afraid. The lessons of Salem remain extremely relevant to us today. Fear is a virus. And when there's a social panic, there is a demand for a swift and decisive system set up to eliminate the threat. In the name of eliminating the threat, you see the authority mechanisms of a society, the authority of government or the courts or the military, being used to operate and justify this system to deal with a threat. Criticism of that system becomes heresy, just as it did in Salem, because now you're not just criticizing the conviction of a particular person, you are undermining the authority and the justice of the entire system that has been set up to deal with this perceived threat. And once established, such a system, freed of the safeguards of presumption of innocence, fair trial, and the right to be protected from torture, once that system is set up, it's a system of terror that becomes driven by its own impetus, as people become more afraid of being caught up in its jaws than they were of the original threat it was set up to deal with. And systems like that inevitably produce large amounts of bloodshed. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone else that you think might appreciate it. On the Villains and Virgins podcast, we'll be looking at other episodes in history that are not as widely discussed, episodes that are sometimes colorful, sometimes freakish, sometimes gory, or sometimes of peculiar interest to me. I hope that you enjoy it, and I'll see you in the next episode.